Okay. Good. Right. Well, welcome everybody. Thank you for coming. There's quite a few on Zoom, as you've seen. Thank you for everybody tuning in. So we haven't got it coming up in Farsi on the screen. And will you be okay?
Yeah.
Perfect. So I thought what we'd do this evening is have a look at this subject, what I'm calling the Inner Ring War, prelude to Christ's return. I think we've all seen, haven't we, the news, what's going on in Israel. And on the 7th of October this year, on the last day of the Feast of Tabernacles, which is a Jewish feast, almost 50 years to the day since the last major war in Israel, which was the Yom Kippur War in 1973, Hamas decided by surprise to invade Israel and killed, as we know, approximately 1,400 Jews and other nationalities, but mainly Jewish people, beheaded people. We know the massacre that took place. And pretty much, I think it's fair to say that every single solitary day since then, it's been headline news, hasn't it? If you put the news on, it's number one. So that's been 3 weeks now. Every day it's headline news. What I thought we'd do this evening is have a look at what I've called the Inner Ring War that I believe is going to take place. I haven't just made this up on the back of events that we see happening right now. I've been doing a weekly World Watch for about 20 years, and maybe for the last 15 years, I've been saying with Bible in hand, I think God is telling us there is something called an initial inner ring war between Israel and her immediate neighbors. And what I'm hoping to show you tonight are the verses that I think tell us that this is the case. All right. So I'm just going to play a little video. Hopefully, I forgot to do something here because I need to share my sound, and I don't think I've remembered to do that. So give me a second. I need to just come out this presentation just a second, because I don't think people at home are going to hear it otherwise. So bear with me just a momento. I forgot to do it. Hold on. Sorry about this. There's a few videos, and I know if I play it, we'll be able to hear it, but those on Zoom might not be able to. So give me a second. So if I share screen, click share sound, click on that. Right, this should work this time. And then if I click on this, it'll take a second to come up. Then if I just do that. Okay, so hopefully I'm going to play a little video now that sort of sets the scene for the events that have just happened and gives us a little bit of history as well. So let's hope this works.
Israel says it's at war after Palestinian militants launched a major terror attack. At the centre of this conflict is Israel's military occupation of one Palestinian territory, the West Bank, and its blockade of the other, the Gaza Strip. To understand what's happening, it helps to go back to World War I, when Britain took control of the region. The land at the time had an Arab majority and a Jewish minority. An Arab rebellion and ongoing Jewish migration was followed by the Holocaust targeting Jews in World War II, and a big increase in Jewish migration. In 1947, the United Nations, with Australia being a key driver, agreed that what had been known as the British Mandate for Palestine would be divided into a Jewish state and an Arab state. The Jewish side accepted this, hence the State of Israel was formed. But the Arab side rejected it, sparking a one-year war as Britain withdrew. But as the years went on, Israel took more land than had been agreed by the UN. Palestinians call this the Nakba, or catastrophe, as hundreds of thousands of Palestinians fled. At the end of the war, Israel controlled all the land in blue, except for Gaza here, which Egypt controlled, the West Bank, which was controlled by Jordan, and the Golan Heights, controlled by Syria. In 1967, in what's known as the Six-Day War, Israel seizes the West Bank, the Gaza Strip and the Golan Heights. In 2005, Israel withdrew from the Gaza Strip, a small coastal territory home to 2.3 million people, one of the most densely populated places in the world. Israel controls the airspace and the sea, and it controls the crossings used to ship most of the goods in and out. The crossing into Egypt is mainly used by people. Conditions for Gazans under the blockade are tough, with an unemployment rate of 50%, as well as deteriorating health systems and infrastructure. The group Hamas was formed in the late 1980s as frustrations grew. Hamas's goal is dedicated to Israel's destruction, and it's been designated a terrorist group by many countries, including Australia. Hamas, which has a militant wing and a political arm, won democratic elections in 2006, but wouldn't renounce violence against Israel and was isolated by the international community. It seized control of Gaza a year later, and while Israel withdrew from Gaza, it continues to occupy the West Bank. This means the Israeli army is the ultimate authority in the West Bank. The 3 million Palestinians there and the 2.3 million in Gaza do not want an Israeli occupation or a blockade. Another point of contention is Jerusalem. It's home to holy sites from 3 major religions: Judaism, Christianity and Islam. Clashes in the region often escalate around major religious holidays, like the Jewish holiday of Yom Kippur or Ramadan. This is a region that's faced tension for years, but these attacks show things could escalate even further.
Sorry, the audio's not coming out the TV. Can you just about hear it?
Yeah.
Good. Okay. They'll hear it at home, I think. So here's a summary of what that video just said. Okay. First of all, it said that Israel was created in 1948, and it was created with UN United Nations approval. It's interesting, that's hardly ever mentioned in any of the news reports, but it was. The world voted in the UN to establish Israel in 1948. The Arabs at that point that we just heard on the video rejected Israel's existence at all at that point, even though the UN had voted for it, and they launched a one-year war against Israel at that point. It created a lot of refugees at that point as well, and some of the refugees ended up in what we now know as the Gaza Strip, and as we'll show you later, there's Palestinian refugees all around Israel. But the Gaza Strip became home to the majority of the refugees that were created when Israel was created back in 1948. That video clip also mentioned that in 1967, there was an attempt to destroy Israel by the surrounding nations, and Israel won that war as well. And at that point, Israel took over more territory. It took over what we now call the West Bank. It took over the Gaza Strip. And it actually, for the first time, took over the entire city of Jerusalem. Hamas came into being as a political and terrorist organization back in the 1980s, I think it was. But the Gaza Strip had elections back in 2006, and the Palestinian people voted overwhelmingly for Hamas to be their elected leaders. So that's why Hamas is running the Gaza Strip, because the Palestinian people voted back then for them to be in power. There haven't been any further elections since then, and Hamas has just continued to run the Gaza Strip. But again, it's not mentioned very often that it was the Palestinians who voted them in. Their stated aim of Hamas, and this has been the case from the very beginning, is the destruction of Israel. That is their stated aim, to destroy Israel. And that has never changed. Jerusalem was also mentioned in that video, and it says that it's a flashpoint because the Palestinians want Jerusalem as their capital, and Israel say Jerusalem is our capital. It's pretty much the only capital city on the planet where there's two different races saying it's our capital city. And the last thing that it said in that video is that there's a danger that this current conflict could spread. So in the talk this evening, and I'm going to do another one next week, this talk this evening is to try and show you that there is, in my view, looking at the Bible, and you might have a different take on it with what you read in the Bible, but my take on it is, with Bible in hand, that there is an initial inner ring war around Israel. And when I say inner ring war, I'm talking about Israel's immediate neighbors that fight a war against Israel with the sole aim of destroying Israel. However, Israel will win this war. Israel's going to be left weakened, but will win this war and actually remove all of the terrorists that are in and around them. And that's why this is so interesting with what's going on. What we're going to look at next week is what happens after that, because Israel, I believe, will win this inner ring war, but there'll be a temporary peace and safety, or peace and security situation that happens, where Israel draws breath and thinks, actually, we're okay now. And believe it or not, into that void, into that sort of peaceful scenario, will come an outer ring of nations, and it's what the Bible calls Armageddon. And that's the other part of the story. So there's an inner ring and an outer circle of nations that come later. By the way, as I've put on there, Israel loses that second war, but survives because Jesus himself returns and intervenes. And this is why we're interested in what's going on, not because we like looking at death and destruction and war and horror, because we don't. What we're looking at it for is, one, because God has told us these things are going to happen, but he's told us these things are going to happen as a sign that Jesus is coming. That's what this is about. All of these events are leading up to the return of Jesus and the establishment of God's kingdom here on earth. So what we're going to do this evening is going to look at a few things. First of all, I want to go back in very briefly into a bit of ancient history with Israel, because you'll never ever hear this bit on any news report, on any mainstream news at all, because they're not interested in ancient Israel. They might go back to 1947, they might go back to the Holocaust, they might go back to the late 1800s, but they just don't care about the history of ancient Israel. But God does care, because he is the one who created them as a people in the first place. So we're going to have a quick look at ancient Israel, because it really helps to see what's going on. Winston Churchill famously said, the further back you look, anybody know the last bit of the phrase? He said, the further back you look, the further forward you can see. And in this case, it's entirely true. And then what we're going to do is have a look at the current situation briefly, and then we're going to look at some passages in the Bible that I believe are talking about this initial inner ring war around Israel. Now, you might wonder why I've got some pyramids on the agenda there, but this is where we're going back to. we're going to very quickly go back to when Israel became a nation. And what happened was the Israelites were in, anybody want to guess where they were? In Egypt. And there were about 2 million of them, and they'd been there for some long time, and they were slaves in Egypt. And God sent 10 plagues against Egypt and pulled all 2 million or so out of Egypt, and they went through the what? That went through the Red Sea. And when they went through the Red Sea, led by Moses, they came to Mount Sinai. And when they got to Mount Sinai, God gave them laws and told them how they were going to be a nation and how they were going to live. But interestingly, while they were at Mount Sinai, before they got to the promised land, God told them where they were going to go and where the promised land was. Anybody know what the promised land was called back then? Canaan. Okay, so all of this, by the way, is happening around about 1,500 years before Jesus was born, so 3,500 years ago. And in Exodus chapter 23, verse 31, God says to Moses, well, there's quite a few verses that he says in relation to the land, but verse 31 says, I, God, will set thy boundary from the Red Sea even unto the sea of the Philistines, and from the desert unto the river, and I will deliver the inhabitants of the land of Canaan into your hand, and you will drive them out before you. And the reason that God was clearing the land of the people and putting his own people in there was because the people in the land of Canaan were, what do you think? Wicked. He said their wickedness is so great, we're going to remove the people out of the land. So just to show you what you see here, I've put about the Sea of the Philistines. And can you see down here where we've got this place called Philistia? If I just put it on a bigger map, you can see what's going on. This is the land of Canaan that God was promising to Moses and to the people. And there's all these different types of people that lived in Canaan. There were the Girgashites and Canaanites and Amorites and Jebusites and Perizzites and Hittites, a lot of ites. And God says all of them are going to get removed. And he said specifically about the Sea of the Philistines. And if you look, here's where the Philistines were. And here is the sea so this was a separate little area, part of Canaan, or it was inside the territory of Canaan. And God said, this is also going to be yours as well. And you can see on the map where it was. And look what you can see on the map. You see this little place here? Gaza was there all the way back at this point. There was a place called Gaza 3,500 years ago, and before that even. So isn't that interesting that even that little place, as small as it is there on the map? Now, what happened was that Moses died just before they were going to go into the promised land. And a chap called Joshua was appointed to take them into the promised land, into Canaan. Now, what is really interesting about this is that God told Joshua to go in and remove all the people out the land. And this is what actually happened. So Joshua chapter 11, verse 21 says, at that time, Joshua and cut off the Anakims from the mountains, from Hebron, from Debir, from Anab, and from all the mountains of Judah, and from all the mountains of Israel. Joshua destroyed them utterly with their cities. There was none of the Anakims left in the land of the children of Israel. Only in Gaza, in Gath, and Ashdod they remained. So basically, that little strip of land where Philistia or the Philistines were, Joshua didn't conquer that area. He left it untouched, even though he should have taken it. And in a couple of chapters after, just to make the point, in Joshua chapter 13, it says that Joshua was, this is in verse 1, Joshua was old and stricken in years, and the Lord said unto him, you are old and stricken in years, and there remains yet very much land to be possessed. In other words, it isn't mission accomplished yet. This is the land that yet remains, and first on the list of a few places that still remained are all the borders of the Philistines. You haven't taken the area of the Philistines, which is that little strip where Gaza is. Can anybody think of a famous Philistine that was causing Israel a major problem? Goliath. Here he is, look. Goliath was a Philistine. And when you read in the Old Testament, the Philistines crop up time and time again as a thorn in the side to Israel. Because Israel never sorted that little area out, they were constantly needling them. And one big old needle was the giant Goliath, who David ended up killing with a stone, as we know. And as I say, we could spend a whole evening just looking at the wars between Israel and the Philistines. Samson springs to mind, and all sorts of people and famous stories and conflict, all because this little area was left and should have been taken. Now, one of the things that God said to in the book of Joshua, chapter 23, if I was going to summarize what's on the screen in front of us now, he basically says, if you follow me, you will stay in the land. If you stop following me, then there's going to be a problem and you will ultimately be taken out of the land. And if you look at that last verse, it says, know for a certainty that the Lord your God will no more drive out any of these nations from before you, but there'll be snares and traps to you and scourges in your sides and thorns in your eyes until you perish from off this good land which the Lord your God has given to you. So if you follow me, all is well and you'll stay in the land. But if you don't, there'll be thorns in your side and there's going to be issues. And obviously the Philistines were a major part of that throughout their history. Now, of course, Israel did go against God numerous times, didn't they? And on a number of occasions, God did remove them out of the land entirely. One of the times was under Nebuchadnezzar, and the Babylonians came in, the Assyrians came in, all different empires came in. Why? Because God allowed them to. Why? Because Israel turned against God, wholesale turned against him at different times. So but God always brought them back again. That's the point. He never got rid of them entirely. He always had a plan for his people and always brought them back. When was the last time when Israel came to a complete end? What year was it when Israel, going back some time now, came to a complete end? AD 70. So what happened was the Jews, the people, were at the time when Christ was crucified, Jesus said, because this is what you're going to do, there's going to be days of vengeance on the people. And he said, basically, the Romans are going to come in and you're going to be scattered into all nations. And about 35 or so years after Jesus was crucified, the Romans did come in, and Israel, about that time in AD 70, came to an end, and the Jews were scattered into all nations on the earth. And it says in Ezekiel chapter 11, therefore say, thus saith the Lord God, I will gather you from the people and assemble you out of the countries where you've been scattered, and I will give you the land of Israel. If you look in Numbers 13, the verse above that, it says, the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, send men to search the land of Canaan, which I give unto the children of Israel. So God originally gave Israel the land. He took them out of the land in AD 70. But in Ezekiel 11, verse 17, he says, I'm going to regather you one day and put you back in the land. Which is why many people, hundreds of years ago, wrote down and said, from their understanding of the Bible, one day Israel will be back in the land. The very first Christadelphian in 1848 wrote exactly that Israel would one day be back in the land. exactly 100 years before Israel was recreated, because Israel did not exist as a nation from AD 70, nearly 2,000 years ago, all the way up to 1948. What do you think was the catalyst for recreating Israel on planet Earth? The Holocaust. 6 million Jews killed, and that was the catalyst to recreate Israel, and the United Nations, as we've already said, agreed it. So back they come into the land after nearly 2,000 years. Now, here's the amazing thing. So basically on the right-hand map is the land that Israel has currently got, and Israel was created, as we say, in 1948. This sort of bluey color here where it says Samaria, this is what's known as the West Bank, and here is Gaza. And if you have a look over here, this was the extent of the kingdom under early kings of Israel around about 1000 BC. And you can see that they had this extra bit of blob on the side here, this blue shape over here. So the kingdom was a little bit bigger back then. God's actual eastern boundary, according to Numbers 34, was actually the Jordan River here, and it's actually their eastern boundary today. This is the Jordan River that flows from the Sea of Galilee down to the Dead Sea down here. But isn't it absolutely astounding? First of all, God says, I will bring you back into your land. And lo and behold, in 1948, they get exactly the same land after 2,000 years. But at the very same point that Israel's created, look what we've got. On the left-hand side, there's Philistia, the problem area with the Philistines and Gaza and Goliath. And look what we've got here. Suddenly the same, it's not exactly the same, but it's pretty close, isn't it, in terms of where it is. Almost identical situation exists again when Israel's recreated. And would we say that this little strip here of the Gaza Strip is a thorn in the side to Israel? You couldn't get a better description, exactly like these guys were on the left all those thousands of years ago. And what the Bible says is that on the left-hand side, they're like pricking briars. And what the Bible says about this time in which we live is that they'll be like pricking briars. They're both causing pain and immense aggravation to Israel. The amazing thing is that scholars believe that the name Palestine, which is where, of course, we get Palestinians, is derived from the name of the people, the Philistines, who occupied part of the region, it says on the History Channel, in the 12th century BC. So even the very name is a derivation of the old name of Philistines, which is amazing, isn't it? After all this time, there's a link between these two people. It says in Ezekiel chapter 28, though, and verse 24, that there's going to be a time where no longer will Israel's scornful neighbors prick and tear at her like briars and thorns, for then they will know that I am the sovereign Lord. This is what the sovereign Lord says. The people of Israel will again live in their own land, the land that I gave my servant Jacob, for I will gather them from distant lands where I have scattered them. So God basically says there's going to come a time when I bring my people back into the land. And at some point, the pricking briars that are causing pain to Israel are going to be removed. Well, they haven't been removed yet because we're seeing it on the TV screen even as we speak, aren't we? So what I want to show you is this. So we're going to look at some passages now. And I'm going to try and show you that there's a number of passages that speak to us about the time when Israel removes the pricking briars, the nearby people that are causing them pain. And I don't know if you've got your Bibles, but it might be worth opening them just so you can see where it is. But this is a very famous couple of chapters in the Bible to do with the last days before Jesus comes back, about conflict that's going to happen in the world, and it's going to be centered on Jerusalem and Israel. So you've got a chapter, Zechariah chapter 12, and I believe that Zechariah chapter 12 is predominantly about the inner ring war. And I'm going to try and prove that to you if I can. And then there's another conflict that comes, and it's in Zechariah chapter 14, which is the outer ring war that we're going to look at next week. So first of all, what I want to try and do is to try and prove to you, if I can, that Zechariah 12 and Zechariah 14 are two different conflicts with two different outcomes involving two different types of people. In my authorized version, Zechariah chapter 12, verse 1 starts off by saying, "The burden of the word of the Lord for Israel, saith the Lord, which stretches forth the heavens and lays the foundation of the earth and forms the spirit of man within him. Behold, I will make Jerusalem a cup of trembling unto all people round about, when they shall be in siege both against Judah and against Jerusalem. And in that day will I make Jerusalem a burdensome stone for all the people. All that burden themselves with it should be cut in pieces, though all the people of the earth be gathered together against it." So I'll just stop there for a minute. This is a major conflict with Jerusalem at its center, isn't it? And God saying there's all these people potentially coming against Israel. So, but I just want to point this out. So in verse 2, and this is in a slightly more modern version, in verse 2, it says, "I will make Jerusalem like an intoxicating drink that makes the nearby people stagger when they send their armies to Jerusalem and Judah." You see that? So in the authorized version, verse 2 says, Jerusalem is a couple of trembling unto all people round about. That word roundabout in the authorized version literally means people that are nearby and encircling them. Nearby, encircling, which is why this modern translation here has got the word nearby. I think some translations even say neighbors. So it's nearby people. And you notice it's the nearby people, they send their armies. So it's all about nearby people, people close by encircling. The other thing that we find out is in verse 6, it says, "On that day I will make the clans of Judah," that literally means the leaders of Judah, "like a flame that sets a wood pile ablaze, or like a burning torch among the sheaves of grain. They will burn up all the neighboring people right and left, while the people living in Jerusalem remain secure." I think that's the New International Version. But you notice again, it's saying that neighboring people, people round about, people close by, the people who are neighbors to Israel. I think in the authorized version, it says Israel will devour all the people round about. So that sounds to me, I don't know if it sounds like this to you, when it says that Israel's going to burn up all the neighboring people right and left, while the people living in Jerusalem remain secure, that sounds like Israel wins, doesn't it? If Israel's going to burn up the surrounding people who've launched a war against them, this sounds to me like they win. And in fact, this modern translation puts that Jerusalem remains secure. If you look at Zechariah 14, which we'll look at more next week, but it doesn't sound like that. This says, "I will gather all the nations to fight against Jerusalem, and the city will be taken, and the houses looted, and the women are going to be raped, and half the population will be taken into captivity, and the rest will be left among the ruins of the city." That doesn't sound like Jerusalem's remaining secure. So my little thesis is this one here is nearby people that come and attack, but Jerusalem survives, and in fact they win. This one in Zechariah 14 is another group of nations come in, and Jerusalem is ruined. The amazing thing is, though, in verse 5 of Zechariah 14, it says, then the Lord my God will come with all the saints with him. And this is the return of Jesus, basically. That's why all this is leading up to Jesus coming into Jerusalem. But let me give you another couple of things to think about. Here's one. Zechariah chapter 12. Do you notice I've highlighted there 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times this word people? It never uses the word nation. It just uses consistently this word people. This word in the Bible is translated 1,836 times that the word used as people and only 18 times as nation. And it's because this is a specific word that means kinsman or kindred. So God's using a specific word, not about nations. He's using a word that's to do with kinsman or kindred. So when God in Zechariah 12 says the people are going to do X, Y, and Z, he's using a word that's to do with kinsman or kindred. When you come to Zechariah 14, it never once uses the word people. God switches to a different word, and now it's nations that are going to come. It's a completely different Hebrew word, and this one is almost always translated as nations. Do you see that they're two different things? One's to do with kinsman and kindred, and now this one in Zechariah 14 is to do with nations. And as we've already pointed out, it's the people round about. It's the people round about. It's the people nearby. It's kinsmen, you might even say tribes that are close to Israel. And notice what it says as well, that the governors of Judah in verse 6 are going to be like a fire among the wood and a torch of fire in a sheaf, and they will devour all the people round about. So it sounds like they use fire to destroy the nearby people who want to destroy Israel. And this is a picture from last night. I mean, when we're looking at the news, we're watching Israel literally using fire to destroy the surrounding nearby people who are fighting against them. This is Benjamin Netanyahu, I think it was yesterday.
I want to make clear Israel's position regarding a ceasefire. Just as the United States would not agree to a ceasefire after the bombing of Pearl Harbor or after the terrorist attack of 9/11, Israel will not agree to a cessation of hostilities with Hamas after the horrific attacks of October 7th. Calls for a ceasefire are calls for Israel to surrender to Hamas, to surrender to terrorism, to surrender to barbarism. That will not happen. Ladies and gentlemen, the Bible says that there is a time for peace and a time for war. This is a time for war for our common future. Today we draw a line between the forces of civilization and the forces of barbarism. It is a time for everyone to decide where they stand. Israel will stand against the forces of barbarism until victory.
So he's going to stand. Sorry, Martin.
The thing that troubles me, I don't understand, as I understand, my knowledge is limited in many respects, but the Jews don't believe in Jesus, do they? They don't believe he's the Messiah.
No.
He's still to come. They don't believe in the Trinity, the Father, the Son, and he's not a God. So that's what troubles me when, we're discussing this. They seem to be representing something that I don't recognise as a Christian. That makes any sense.
Yeah, it does. So at the minute, they've come back in unbelief in the main. There are some believers, little pockets of believers, a bit like in this country, there's pockets of believers, but you might say the vast majority don't. So they've actually come back in unbelief at this point. And in fact, in Zechariah chapter 12, it sort of says this, because if you have a look in verse 10 of Zechariah chapter 12, at this time when all this war is going on, God says, I will pour upon the house of David and upon the inhabitants of Jerusalem the spirit of grace and of supplication, and they shall look upon me whom they have pierced, and they shall mourn for him as one mourns for his only son, and shall be in bitterness for him as one that's in bitterness for his firstborn. Who do you think is talking about when it says they'll look upon him whom they have pierced? Jesus. So when Jesus comes back, it's at that point that the eyes and the veil, if you like, of the millions of Jews, as you say, that don't currently believe in, well, they know Jesus existed, but they don't accept him as the Son of God and the Messiah and the only way sins can be forgiven through Jesus. But there is this point when they reach that recognition, and it's when Jesus comes back. Now, Jesus is coming back to save the people. So even though they're in unbelief, they're going to be taken through the fire themselves, and God is going to send him back because ultimately the kingdom of God that's going to be established here on earth is going to be centered on Israel. And Jerusalem is going to be the capital of the entire world when he does come back. And God has brought his people back. They haven't yet recognized the Jesus element. They recognize God and they worship God. And there's a lot that don't even do that. But so it's what we're not saying is that what the Israel's doing is right, and God thinks, yes, I bless everything that every Israeli does and every Jew does. No. But as part of his plan and the working out of his plan, this is clearly part of it. And that's what he's telling us about. And it's leading up to the intervention of Jesus coming back. In Zechariah 12, it says that, we've read this, I will make Jerusalem like an intoxicating drink. In the authorized version, it says, I will make Jerusalem a cup of trembling. And the word trembling means reeling, as if you're staggering, if you're drunk, which is why this version says it's like an intoxicating drink. In other words, Jerusalem, for the surrounding people, it's a bit like they're drunk with Jerusalem. Jerusalem makes them go drunk. If you look at what it is to be drunk, it says negative effects of drunkenness are typed into Google. It affects part of the brain associated with judgment and decision-making, causing you to be more reckless and uninhibited. So Jerusalem is driving them mad and crazy so that they do things. And I'm talking about the Palestinians here, because God is accusing the people of being like this that are surrounding Israel. It makes them go crazy. Does anybody know, by the way, this latest attack by Hamas? Does anybody know what they've called it? What's the name of this uprising? Here it is. Operation Al-Aqsa Flood. And you might think, what's that got to do with anything? What is Al-Aqsa? Does anybody know what that refers to, Al-Aqsa?
What's to do with God, anyway?
It's to do with the mosque that is built on Temple Mount in Jerusalem. Have a watch of this.
Memory. So why is Hamas calling its attacks on Israel Operation Al-Aqsa Flood? To know the nomenclature for Hamas's attacks, it's important to understand the complex and sensitive issue that has turned a place of worship into a point of conflict. The Temple Mount is located in Jerusalem. It's the holiest place for Jews. It's also referred to as the Dome of Rock. However, the compound also houses the third holiest site in Islam, called the Al-Aqsa Mosque. The Dome of Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque are often confused to be the same building, but in reality, they are two different buildings in the same compound. The compound also has the Western Wall. It's the last remnant of the Sun Temple, which dates back almost 2,000 years.
So basically, when Hamas launched this operation on the 7th of October, they called it the Al-Aqsa Flood. In other words, the Jerusalem storm. It is all about Jerusalem. That's what this is about. They want Jerusalem as their capital. They want their own state, and they want Israel completely destroyed in the process. And God says in Zechariah 12, that's what it's going to be about. It's going to be about Jerusalem. And they've declared in even what they've called this uprising, it is a Jerusalem uprising. But it isn't only Zechariah that talks about this. There's another interesting passage in Psalm 83. that I think is very, very poignant with the events that we're seeing. So have a look at Psalm 83. It's written by somebody called Asaph. In my Bible, it's got a Psalm of Asaph. And when you look up about Asaph, it tells you that Asaph was a seer or a prophet. So this chap was a prophet. And have a look at Psalm 83, because I think it details for us events that are happening right now. So Psalm 83 says, "Keep not thou silence, O God, hold not thy peace, and be not still, O God, for lo, thine enemies make a tumult. They that hate thee have lifted up the head. They have taken crafty counsel against thy people and consulted against thy hidden ones. They have said, Come, let us cut them off from being a nation, that the name of Israel may be no more in remembrance. For they have consulted together with one consent. They're confederate against thee. And now we've got a list of who's involved. The tabernacles of Edom, the Ishmaelites of Moab, and the Hagarenes, Gebal and Ammon and Amalek, the Philistines with the inhabitants of Tyre. Asher is also joined with them." And we'll stop there for a minute. So what you've got here is a confederacy of Israel's enemies. And what do they want to do? What does it just say? What's their aim of this confederacy, this alliance? Destroy Israel. We want to do, and you notice it's against your people. So God is still seeing the Jews as his people, even though they don't believe in him. Do you see that? God still sees them as his people, even though they don't all believe in him or follow him. They are still his people because they're related back to Abraham. It's just that they've rejected him at this point in time. Many of them have, we know. But anyway, so what we've got there is an alliance of people saying, let's cut off Israel from being a nation. Does that resonate? Are we hearing anything about Israel's enemies saying we want to cut them off from being a nation? Now, the question, therefore, is, who are these people that are saying it? Because we've got the tabernacles of Edom and Ishmaelites and Moab and Hagarenes and people we've never heard of, right? So what you've got to do is go back to think, well, when Asaph wrote, where did he think Edom was? Where did he think that Moab was? Where did he think Amalek was? Where were these places? So all you do is go back to an ancient map, which we'll have a look at in just a second, and you find out where they are. What's just been listed out in Psalm 83 are 10 tribes. We've got the tents of Edom, which I'm going to show you is in Jordan. Edom is modern day Jordan. You notice it says the tents of Edom. It doesn't just say Edom, it says the tents of Edom. That's very significant. I'll show you why in just a minute. There's the Ishmaelites, which are possibly, they were a nomadic tribe, this one, so they're a bit more difficult to track down, but possibly northern, very north, Saudi Arabia. Moab was a nation itself, that was in modern day Jordan. The Hagarites were a tribe in Jordan. Gebal was a tribe up in North Lebanon. Ammon was a tribe in Jordan. Amalek was a tribe in South Israel. Philistia, we've already looked at where the Philistines were. They were in the South Gaza Strip area, where Hamas is right now. Tyre is a city in Lebanon. You can go to Tyre today if you felt like it. You can still go there. It happens to be the stronghold of Hezbollah, who are the other terrorist organization who want to destroy Israel. And finally, it says Asher is joined with this little lot, and Asher really is probably the only nation on the list. And it is either a reference purely to Syria, or it might also include a slightly bigger area through Iraq, right the way across to Iran, because in ancient times, Assyria was quite a big empire at its height. So it could not just be Syria. It definitely is Syria to some extent, but it could also be the whole arc of Assyria that spread much wider afield. So if you put all those places on the map, this is what I think it looks like. There is the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Judah. So these are God's people here in the blue and the purple. There's Philistia, look, where there's Gaza down here. This is the area of Philistia. So they were on the list. There's Edom, Moab, Ammon. There's Gebal up there. There's Tyre. Here's Asher, which is around definitely in the Syrian area. Here's the Ishmaelites. There's the Hagarites. There's Amalek. All of them surround Israel, don't they? And maybe in amongst Israel to some extent, because the Amalekites were in and amongst the people and causing them trouble. So I think what God is saying is, in Psalm 83 through his prophet Asaph, is that there's going to be an alliance of Israel's immediate enemies, and they want to destroy Israel. Now, you could say, to some extent, there's been wars before, hasn't there, as we've already said. So in 1967, there was a war, wasn't there? And 1973, there was a war, the Yom Kippur War. And so some have said, well, maybe this was fulfilled all the way back in those wars, maybe. But there's a massive reason why it wasn't fulfilled in either of those years. And the reason is that they're still there. Because what I'm going to show you in a minute is that Psalm 83 says that they are going to be destroyed. Just as Zechariah 12 says that the people surrounding Israel that are fighting over Jerusalem are going to be burned up, so this psalm says the same thing, that they're going to come to an end. And they haven't come to an end. So Psalm 83 hasn't been fulfilled as yet. You might wonder why God said first on the list were the tents of Edom. Well, interestingly, in 1948, when the conflict, the Arabs launched a conflict to try and destroy Israel when it was created, there were many Palestinian refugees created, and lots of them fled into Jordan, and they were stuck in tents in Jordan. And remarkably, even till this day, they're still effectively in a compound in tents in Jordan. And that figure's out of date because there's now over 2 million of them in Jordan. So God doesn't necessarily say the whole of Jordan. He's saying there's a group of people in tents in Jordan. I think it's a reference to the Palestinian situation. In fact, I didn't realize this, but if you can look this up if you type in to Google Palestinian registered refugees, you'll find there's a map that shows you where all the Palestinian refugees are. And every single one of those red blobs is where they are. So you've got them, this is Tyre in Lebanon, around here. This is Gebal in North Lebanon. There's red blobs that go further up. I've just cut it off slightly. There's Palestinian refugees in Syria and around Damascus. There's Palestinian refugees, obviously in Jordan, as we've said. There's Palestinian refugees in and amongst Israel on the West Bank. There's Palestinian refugees in Gaza itself. In fact, the very places that God's listed out in Psalm 83 are the very places where the Philistines or the Palestinians are. Isn't that amazing? Exactly the same. One of the people that it said on the list was the inhabitants of Tyre. If you do a bit of research on Hezbollah, it doesn't make pleasant reading because they say we want to destroy Israel. That's exactly the same as Hamas. They want to finish off Israel. And it says that Hezbollah's stronghold is in Tyre in Lebanon. What did it say in Psalm 83? Gebal, Ammon, Amalek, the Philistines with the inhabitants of Tyre. And here we are in these last days with the inhabitants, some of the inhabitants of Tyre calling for the complete destruction of Israel. That's why Hezbollah exists, to destroy Israel, or that's why what they want to do. The Philistines, as we've already said, are the equivalent of the Palestinians. They also want to destroy Israel. Amazingly, and I don't think this is a coincidence, in Psalm 83 verse 2, it says, "For lo, thine enemies make a tumult, and the Hebrew word for tumult is Hamas. Isn't that amazing? So the name Hamas is even in this chapter there in Hebrew, and the word tumult means to rage war and to be in uproar. You notice down here, this is, you can look it up, this is the whatever you call it, the manifesto, if you like, of Hamas. Israel will cease, well, it says on the destruction of Israel, Israel will exist and will continue to exist until Islam will obliterate it, just as it obliterated others before it. And there's a whole, lots of words around the destruction of Israel. Now, this is amazing. This is only a couple of days ago. Jordan has got a peace agreement with Israel. And so some have wondered how and why would Jordan get involved? But this was in Middle East Eye. It says Israel-Palestinian war, tensions simmer in Jordan as Hamas urges tribes, that's interesting, tribes, kinsmen, to join the conflict. And Jordan, who's been very much on side with the West, is being dragged in because its population is totally against Israel. So even though the leadership of Jordan is on side with Israel, they're being pressured from their own population to get involved and do something about it. And as we've just said, there's nearly 2 million or over 2 million Palestinian refugees in Jordan itself. This was the 25th of October, so about 6 days ago, 5 or 6 days ago, in the Daily Telegraph, Hamas and Hezbollah leaders meet to plan path to real victory in Gaza. So here we've got a coming together of the two terrorist organizations. It says their goal, according to a statement carried on Hezbollah-run and Lebanese state media, is to achieve a real victory for the resistance in Gaza and Palestine and halt Israel's treacherous and brutal aggression against our oppressed and steadfast people in Gaza and the West Bank. And basically, when they talk about victory, they mean the destruction of Israel. And what does it say? Verse 3 of Psalm 83, they have taken crafty counsel against thy people, consulted together. They've said, come, let us cut them off from being a nation, so that Israel's no more in remembrance. And we're seeing on our screens the Confederacy coming together to try to destroy Israel.
Overnight, Israeli aircraft have struck targets in the south of Lebanon. The country says the airstrikes were in response to mortar and rockets fired by Hezbollah. Alex Rossi has more on the escalating tensions between Israel and Hezbollah in southern Lebanon.
Hezbollah fighters take aim and attack Israeli positions. This is happening on a daily basis. The IDF is responding by striking back at the militant group. And in the middle, UN peacekeepers. They're still out on patrol monitoring the situation, but they're worried about where the violence is heading.
It is a very concerning moment. It is a very concerning moment, a very tense moment. But we are still on the ground. Our troops have not left. But we need to be very careful because this exchange of fire is going on a daily basis all along the blue line.
And Arab countries are warning the chance of a wider regional conflict is becoming more real by the day.
So with Bible in hand, seems to me as if this is it could easily become this inner ring war, couldn't it? And maybe it isn't this time, and maybe it all blows over and there's another cycle that's to come down the line. But as I said to you earlier on, I've done the weekly World Watch for 20 years today. I started it 20 years ago today. And every week since then, I've looked at prophecy, looked at events, and I've looked back through it, and never once in the last 20 years has there been anything close to what we're seeing now that looks like it could be fulfilling these verses. Just to say what happens in Psalm 83, if you have a look at verse 9, the prophet Asaph says, do unto these people that have risen up against Israel, it says, do unto them as unto the Midianites, as to Sisera, as to Jabin. And then in verse 11 it says, make their nobles like Oreb and like Zeb, yea, all their princes as Zebah and Zalmunna. So the 6 people that the prophet Asaph says, God, do unto these people that want to destroy Israel, do unto them like these 6 people. And when you go and find these 6 people, they're all in the book of Judges in just a few chapters, from Judges chapter 4 to Judges chapter 8. And all of them were destroyed by Israel. Sisera was the captain of a Midianite army, and he was destroyed. Jabin was king of Canaan, and he was destroyed. The nobles like Oreb and Zeb were destroyed, and the princes like Zebah and Zalmunna were also destroyed. And Asaph is saying, bring Israel's enemies to an end like this. Does anybody know what happened to Sisera, by the way? Exactly. First on the list is probably the most famous out of those people. Sisera was killed by Jael, is it? I think it was Jael.
Yeah.
And she hammered a tent peg through his head to the ground. All recorded. And God and Asaph says, do unto them like that. And one of the things that Netanyahu has said is that we're going to crush the head of Hamas. And I'm sure he isn't necessarily, maybe he is, but that's exactly what happened to Sisera. And so I come back to say that the very fact that Israel's enemies are still surrounding them and pricking them and hurting them is evidence that Psalm 83 has not yet been fulfilled, but it will be. And look at the very end of the psalm. It says, fill their faces with shame, that they may seek thy name, O Lord. Let them be confounded and troubled forever. Yea, let them be put to shame and perish, that men may know that you, whose name alone is Jehovah, art the most high over all the earth. The conclusion of this war is that somehow or other, all men know that God is God over all the earth. Now, that's not happened, has it? But what do you think is going to happen that will make all men know that there is a God over all the earth when Jesus returns? There can be no other point in all history until Jesus comes back. And that's why Psalm 83 is leading up to that point. Can you bear with me 10 minutes, or have you had enough?
No.
Let me just show you this, because I believe this is another passage that's also related to the events that we're looking at. It's Isaiah chapter 17. And in Isaiah chapter 17, you read about something called the burden of Damascus. Behold, Damascus is taken away from being a city. It will be a ruinous heap, right? That's what verse 1 says. Now, this is sort of interesting, because if you go to Google and type in the word Damascus, and then you go to Wikipedia, you don't have to go to Wikipedia, you can go to lots of places. It says that Damascus is one of the oldest continually inhabited cities in the world. In all history, Damascus has never, ever come to a complete end. Jerusalem has on several occasions. It's been utterly destroyed. But not Damascus. It's kept going and going. It's had wars and destruction, but it's never stopped being a city. But God says that Damascus is going to cease being a city. And therefore, it hasn't happened yet. And therefore, you say, well, when perhaps does the destruction of Damascus occur? And I believe that the destruction of Damascus occurs because Syria is involved as one of the inner ring nations against Israel, because Syria borders Israel, and Syria and Israel are technically at war and hate each other. Now, how Damascus comes to an end from being a city, I don't know, but it could be absolutely horrendous. In fact, Jeremiah chapter 49 says that all the fighting men in Damascus will be killed in one single day. And so it could be, imagine that this war keeps escalating and Hezbollah get involved and Iran sends more weapons and Yemen gets involved and then Syria gets drawn in. Israel has already threatened a few days ago that if Syria gets involved, they will bomb Damascus. That's what they've said. What it also says in Psalm 17 is that the fortified towns of northern Israel, it actually says Ephraim, but it's code for northern Israel, will also be destroyed, and the royal power of Damascus will end. In that day, Israel's glory will grow dim. So what I'm believing is this, with Bible in hand, that when Hezbollah do get involved in this conflict and Syria get involved in this conflict, that northern Israel will be weakened. They're not going to escape unscathed, but the southern Israel, where Jerusalem is, won't be impacted in any way near the same amount. And if you look at Hezbollah, their rockets and missiles are aimed into Tel Aviv and northern areas of Israel. So it isn't going to be easy for Israel. I'm not saying the inner ring war means that they win and they've got no damage. There is damage, but they win. Have a look and listen to this.
There has been a major sort of increase in terms of the violence that we are seeing in West Asia, with Israeli strikes now taking place on Damascus and Aleppo airports in Syria. This is something which has been reported in just the last little while. As we understand it, air travel into Damascus and Aleppo has now been stopped. This also comes at a time when the Iranian foreign minister's aircraft was on its way to Damascus, but we believe the aircraft has turned around now after the bombing on Damascus airport, which is not operational at the moment. Neither is Aleppo. Let's go straight across now to my colleague Kadamani Sharma, who joins us for the latest news. Kadamani, what are you hearing?
Well, what we are hearing at the moment, Vishnu, is that both the airports of Syria, Aleppo and Damascus have been attacked. But this is something which has happened.
So it's all happening, isn't it? And each day seems to go another step worse and another step worse. And we're seeing trouble, aren't we, in London? We're seeing trouble in the capital cities around the world. America has sent two huge aircraft fleets, hasn't it, into, you were telling me about this, Alfie, on Sunday. Everybody is on edge, aren't they, in the world over this right now. This feels very different from the previous skirmishes that we've had. The last couple of slides are in Joel chapter 3. God says, this is God talking. We'll look more at Joel 3 next week. What are you to me, O Tyre and Zidon, and all the regions of Philistia? Isn't that interesting? God says, what are you to me? What is Hamas to do with me? And the answer is the grand total of nothing. Do they worship God? No. They're about trying to destroy God's people. The Jews are God's people. Are you paying me back for something? If you are paying me back, I will return your payment on your own head swiftly and speedily. And again, in Joel chapter 3, it goes on and talks about the great conflict that's coming. Proclaim this among the nations, consecrate war, stir up the mighty men, let all the men of war draw near, let them come up, beat your plowshares into swords and your pruning hooks into spears. Let the weak say, I am a warrior. I think the AV, the authorized version, says, let the weak say, I am strong. Amazingly, those words, the opposite of those words, are also mentioned in the book of Isaiah, where it says, beat your swords into plowshares and your spears into pruning hooks. And if you go into the United Nations building in New York, over the front door are those words. And yet God says that the opposite is going to happen at this time. Money is going to pour into weapons because there is great conflict. The last slide is, and I've taken it, and we've already read it. This is Zechariah 12, verse 10. During this inner ring war, at some point around the inner ring war, during it, just after it, or at some point, it says, they will look on me whom they have pierced and they will mourn, talking about the Jewish people. And this, to me, must be talking about the physical return of Jesus Christ. How can we look on Jesus whom has been pierced? Well, you can in your mind's eye, or you could look in a picture book of or a picture like I've got on the screen. But I think this is not looking at a picture book. I don't think this is in mind's eye. I think this is the actual physical return of Jesus at this point. And they will look on him whom they've pierced and they will mourn. So look, I know we've gone through a lot of stuff there and there's a lot to sort of get your head around, and I haven't covered all the pieces of this jigsaw puzzle by any means, but hopefully you can see that God is in control. He's told us in advance about what's going to happen, and the events that are happening now are leading up to Jesus coming back, and that's why we're watching it. Next week, we'll look at the war that comes after this one. And I don't know how big the gap is between this initial inner ring war and the time of temporary peace, and then the outer ring of nations coming in. But they will come in. And what we're going to see next week is that the outer ring of nations that come in are Russia and Iran and Turkey and Libya and Ethiopia and nations like that. That's what we're going to have a look at, and we'll see how and why that comes about. Thank you for listening. I might just stop the share and try and stop the recording.